Our subject this morning is grief, and I want to begin with a couple of readings. One is entitled, What I Learned from My Mother. I learned from my mother how to love the living, how to have plenty of vases on hand in case you have to rush to the hospital with peonies cut from the lawn, black ants still stuck to the buds. I learned to save jars large enough to hold fruit salad for a whole grieving household, to cube home-canned pears and peaches, to slice through the maroon grape skins and flick out the seeds with a knife point. I learned to attend viewings even if I didn't know the deceased, to press the moist hands of the living, to look in their eyes and offer sympathy, as though I understood loss even then. I learned that whatever we say means nothing. What anyone will remember is that we came. I learned to believe I had the power to ease awful pains materially like an angel. Like a doctor, I learned to create from another's suffering my own usefulness. And once you know how to do this, you can never refuse. To every house you enter, you must offer healing. A chocolate cake you baked yourself, the blessing of your voice, your chaste touch. And from the poet Denise Levertov, this poem entitled Talking to Grief. Ah, grief, I should not treat you like a homeless dog who comes to the back door for a crust, for a meatless bone. I should trust you. I should coax you into the house and give you your own corner, a worn mat to lie on, your own water dish. You think I don't know you've been living under my porch. You long for your real place to be readied before winter comes. You need your name, your collar, and tag. You need the right to warn off intruders, to consider my house your own, and me your person, and yourself my own dog. Over my years with you at UU Bridge, I've preached several times about grief, I think. This morning I'll probably say some of the same things I said then. I will also say some new things because we are in a new place. We are in the midst of a pandemic with 5 million people dead worldwide and more than 750,000 dead in the US. That's 16% of the deaths, although the US has only about 4% of the world's population. At first, we thought the pandemic was a pause. Now, we know it is a place. We are in that place, and we do not know when or if we will ever get out of it. Part of that place is grief. Grief is something that we all experience, and we're especially experiencing it now and in recent times. Perhaps it would be good to examine what it is and how we might deal with it. Grief is our emotional, psychological, and spiritual response to loss. We all experience loss, even children, like a child whose dog or cat dies. It is well that we know how to recognize grief and even when to anticipate it, to understand its various stages and their likely effect upon us, to think about how to deal with it, work our way through it, and gain value from it. We think of grief primarily as what happens to us when someone dies, and of course that is an experience of loss which triggers grief. When we lose a friend, a spouse or a partner, a colleague, a parent, a sibling, a child, we are washed over by grief and maybe overcome by it. Sometimes a loss is in the natural order of things, and we think we are ready for it. When an aging parent who has lived a long life but has been in painful decline for some time dies, there is even relief. Relief that the one who died is now freed of earthly suffering. Relief even that caregiving arrangements, which can be very burdensome, are now at an end. But even if we thought we were ready, usually we find we were not. Grief comes anyway, and we must deal with it. Often there are collateral losses which we did not anticipate and do not even realize are causing us grief. Suppose as an adult you moved away from the town where you grew up, but your parents remained there. Maybe a couple of times a year you go back to visit, and you see not only your parents, but neighbors, old friends, familiar places from your childhood. When the last of your parents dies, Once you've been back to clean out the house and settle affairs, you have no reason to go back there ever again. You have lost not only your parents, but friendly acquaintances you'll never speak to again, familiar places you'll never visit again. These losses, too, can affect the grief you experience. There are also times of loss other than death which can bring us grief. The loss of a job, the end of a relationship, the loss of physical or mental ability because of age or illness or injury. Sometimes losses of this kind are temporary, but when we know they are permanent, it is especially difficult. Even happy transitions in life, ones we have planned and worked for and look forward to, can involve loss and grief. When we move to a new job, when we move to a new house or a new city, when the children leave the nest, when we retire, we experience loss, and that brings about grief. One of my classmates in seminary did a number of year-long interim ministries, moving after each one to a new location. Then she took up a permanent ministry, and I saw her at a minister's meeting once, and I asked her why she was no longer doing interim ministries, and her answer was quick and simple. I couldn't stand the grief. It's been about 50 years since Elizabeth Kubler-Ross identified and described the various stages of grief, and you're probably familiar with her writings. She outlined 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. What's the first thing we say when the police officer arrives at the door to inform us that someone has died in an auto accident? Oh no, no! We want to deny that the bad thing has happened, that the loss has occurred. This stage usually doesn't last very long, but it's good for a person not to be alone when it does occur. Others can provide comfort at this difficult time just by being there. Then often comes anger and blaming. If the Air Force hadn't canceled that contract, I wouldn't have lost my job. I told Johnny over and over again not to ride his motorcycle so fast. There's so much strong emotion in us, we need somewhere to put it. We want somebody to be at fault, someone or something specific we can rail against, because we can't rail against the fact of what has happened. Then comes the bargaining stage. We make promises which we probably wouldn't be able to keep. If Susie will just take me back, I'll never drink another drop of whiskey. If I can be cured of this cancer, I'll never smoke another cigarette. If I can just get these bills paid off, I'll never use a credit card again. If I can just get another job, I promise I'll be on time every day. Bargaining. Next comes the stage of depression, which may include sadness, crying, guilt, fear, and even physical symptoms like fatigue, nausea, lowered immunity, weight loss or gain, aches and pains, insomnia. This stage usually lasts the longest, and it is what we often think of when we think of grief. This is the stage when people need someone to listen, a friend to be present, a counselor to understand, maybe even medication to blunt the pain and help us through it. At this stage, if this stage is especially intense or lasts an inordinately long time, say more than a year, it may become what psychologists describe as complicated grief. Complicated grief can occur when the loss was painful for multiple reasons, such as when a relationship ended by death, was in difficulty or transition, and the grieving person realizes that reconciliation now can never come about. Complicated grief can lead to destructive behaviors, things like excessive drinking, substance abuse, promiscuity, severe disruption of sleeping habits. A person experiencing complicated grief can really benefit from professional help. At last, we come to the final stage of grief, which is acceptance. At this stage, we're no longer crying for long periods, maybe occasionally, no longer hoping or expecting that our loved one is going to return. We are able once again to take up the routines and companions of life and even to enjoy them. By this time, we have reframed the loss and given it a new perspective and meaning. Instead of hoping for the return of our loved one and feeling we cannot get along without her or him, we accept that the one lost is no longer with us, but has become part of the pantheon of all those we knew who no longer walk this earth. We can appreciate and honor and celebrate their lives and enjoy the memory of them. We can laugh along with our crying. Like a child who has lost a pet, eventually we know that they are in a different place on the path toward eternity, a place where we will be one day as well, bringing a new and different value to us and to the universe. We can rejoice that we knew them and were part of their lives and they a part of ours. We can even celebrate life and enjoy it. We cannot get to this place of acceptance after a major loss without moving through the stages of grief. Not everyone experiences them in exactly the same order or the same way, and sometimes we skip some of them. For the unexpected losses around happy transitions, for example, we often do not go through the denial, anger, and bargaining stages, but start in right with depression and sadness. For example, when we retire, it slowly, or perhaps suddenly, dawns on us that we are not regularly going to see our work companions anymore. When we move to a new, grander house, we may be surprised to realize how much we miss the fireplace, or the view from the window, or some quirkiness about the old one. Whatever our loss, there is going to be some time of depression and sadness, and we have some work to do to move through it to the state of acceptance. That is the work of grief through the lens of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. More recent work by Victoria Chang takes a more current view. She writes of the relationship between memory and grief and relates it to things happening because of climate change. We are losing land the size of a football field every hour through coastal erosion. Cajuns, a proud people who have lived for generations near the mouth of the Mississippi, find their homeland wasting away. She spoke to one who said, "If I have to leave here, will I still be a Cajun?" Chang says we should talk about the grief which climate change and other forces are bringing to bear upon us. She quotes Shakespeare, "Gives sorrow words, the grief that does not speak knits up the o'erwrought heart and bids it break." She also rejects the idea that if we are healthy, grief should be over in a year at most. She writes this, "Grief is one of the things our culture tries to fix. But grief cannot be fixed. It just is. Grief shouldn't have to end. My mother is still dead. Grief and joy are intertwined. Without grief, we couldn't have joy." I can identify with that. My mother has been dead for nearly 30 years, but I still experience an empty place when I think about her. And so we should know when grief is coming. We should anticipate its stages and try to be ready to deal with them. We should be aware that grief will sometimes return when we thought it was over, often on the anniversary of a loss or at some other time, maybe a holiday, for example, which was important to us. Because we can only reach the stage of acceptance and new perspective by moving through the other stages of grief, we should trust it. We should not treat it like a homeless dog, but coax it into the house and give it its own corner. It will nurture us and be our companion through a difficult time. There is also a role for us to play when others grieve. Being present is the main part of it, and nothing else matters very much. Whatever we say means nothing, and what anyone will remember is that we came. Another minister told me that when she had been at her first church for only a couple of weeks, she got a call that a member of the congregation had died. She said, "I didn't know what I was supposed to do. So I went home and baked a loaf of bread and went over to the house. I didn't know what I was going to say, but it turned out to be all right. It didn't make much difference what I said, and what I had done turned out to be the right thing." Now, as a new minister, she had a mentor, an experienced minister, and she told him about this experience. He smiled and said to her, "Yes, you were exactly right, but you didn't really need to take the bread." As the poet said, "To every house you enter, you must offer healing. A chocolate cake you baked yourself, the blessing of your voice, your chaste touch." Grief has much to teach us, and we should trust it. For when we come out on the other side, we are able to enjoy and appreciate life in a new and deeper way. The person or thing we lost becomes part of our precious memories and can remain a gift to us for as long as we live. We celebrate life which includes both birth and death, and they give meaning to the interval of life which lies in between. When we have trusted grief and coaxed it in the door and let it do its work, the sun comes up again, and we give thanks for all the joys of this life we share. That is what grief can teach us. Those are some of my thoughts about grief in this strange and troubling time. What thoughts do you have? Let the congregational dialogue begin.